Theater, the Powell Campus Center. It is warm and cozy, and the coffee and tea are hot and free. Before starting, we have a few announcements. First, next Thursday's forum will be by Jeremy Grant, Assistant Professor, School of Psychology. Jeremy's talk will be on racial battle fatigue in Black students. There are some other events this week to announce, namely the AU String Orchestra concert is Friday at 7:30 p.m. in Miller Theater. Enrollment Management will host the final fall preview day Saturday from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. in Joyce Walton, followed by tours. If you see any high school juniors and seniors on campus with their families, give them a warm Alfred welcome. Tomorrow, November 15th, the WGST Roundtable in the Herrick Book and Lounge from 12:20 to 1:10 will host Jazz Rosa's capstone, adding finishing touches to campus resource for sexual health. Attend to give Jazz feedback and help create a positive initiative for campus needs. Max Koskoff is still seeking volunteers to host students who cannot leave for Thanksgiving break. Email Koskoff at koskoff@alfred.edu for more details. On Saturday at 6 p.m., there will be a DIY snow globe event as a week-long event hosted by the Craft Collective in Howell Hall. Finally, on Handshake, there will be a virtual career fest on Wednesday, November 20th from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. Without further ado, today's forum will be given by Roberto Che Espinoza. Roberto's talk is titled Bridging Radical Differences, Imagining Our Future Together. Roberto, the floor is yours.
So I changed the title, just so you know, Democracy as Belonging and Freedom, a Liberationist Vision. And let me just pull up my talk here and start the slides. You're going to see, so Chase Angier inspired this. You're going to see a series of pictures, and then my narrative is going to be coupling the pictures. And because I'm a problem child and I brought a Mac, we're learning together. So, democracy as belonging and freedom, a liberationist vision. Today, more than any other day, we are leaning into possible futures together. We have just had what will be a consequential election, just as every election is. And we are now faced with the question, who are we? What does democracy look like in the future? We don't know. We are still charting this path. And I want to suggest that there are particular values that create conditions for democracy. I want to talk about that today. We're exploring democracy through two core values, belonging and freedom. These values are often celebrated as cornerstones of democratic life. Yet, as my colleague, Eddie Glaude Jr. points out, they cannot be fully understood without acknowledging their counterpoints, unbelonging and unfreedom. True democracy is about inclusivity, justice, and collective liberation. But it is also an ongoing struggle against forces that deny these ideals. Drawing on thinkers like James Baldwin, W.E.B. Du Bois, Toni Morrison, Gloria Anzaldúa, Enrique Dussel, and the Zapatistas, we'll examine how belonging and freedom are foundational to democracy and discuss what it takes to create a democratic society that honors these principles. In a democratic society, belonging isn't merely about citizenship or legal status. It's about feeling a part of the collective we. Yet, as James Baldwin and W.E.B. Du Bois reminds us, the reality of democracy has often been built on exclusion. For Baldwin, America's promises of belonging ring hollow for those whom society has systematically marginalized. Baldwin saw that Black Americans were denied the very belonging that democracy promised, treated as outsiders within their own country. Du Bois' concept of double consciousness highlights this experience of unbelonging, as Black Americans have historically been forced to see themselves through the eyes of a society that devalues them. Democracy, in this sense, becomes an exercise in exclusion, defining who belongs by deciding who does not. This exclusion persists not only through race, but also through the marginalization of queerness, indigeneity, and other identities that disrupt the dominant narrative. Gloria Anzadua's work gives us a nuanced view of belonging. In her Borderlands La Frontera book, she writes of existing in the borderlands, not fully belonging to any one culture, identity, or nation. This concept extends Baldwin and Du Bois' insights, revealing that people in the in-between spaces live within a constant negotiation of identity. Anzadua suggests that belonging isn't a passive state, but a continual act of creation and resistance against structures that seek to impose rigid categories. Democracy, from this view, must honor the complexity of identities that do not fit easily within social norms. Enrique Dussels' liberation philosophy deepens this critique by showing how Western democracy has historically excluded colonized and indigenous peoples. He argues that democracy must be grounded in the voices and experiences of those who have been systematically othered and positioned outside the structures of power, I would say empire. Dussels' transmodern approach calls for a democracy that goes beyond Western ideals, centering those who have been forced into unbelonging. Freedom is often spoke of as a core democratic right, but who is truly free? For Toni Morrison, freedom is not only about individual autonomy, it is also a matter of societal responsibility. In Playing in the Dark, Morrison highlights how American identity, and thus American freedom, has been constructed in opposition to Blackness, creating a framework where some are free precisely because others are not. In other words, freedom in American democracy has often been selective, preserving power for some at the expense of others. The Zapatistas in Mexico, where my family is from, offer a powerful example of collective freedom, one that is rooted in community rather than individualism. In their struggle for indigenous autonomy, the Zapatistas have redefined freedom not as separation from others, but as a shared commitment to communal well-being. They are approximating wellness through community. Their rallying cry of Ya Basta, which means enough, is a demand for a democracy that respects indigenous ways of life and self-determination. They have shown that true freedom and democracy requires recognizing the right of communities to govern themselves, free from external control. Eddie Glaude Jr., following Baldwin and Du Bois, would argue that any nation of freedom and democracy is incomplete without an honest reckoning of unfreedom, the ways in which society systematically denies freedom to marginalized people. In his work, Glaude challenges us to see freedom as a practice of dismantling systems of oppression. In this sense, freedom is not an individual achievement, but a collective endeavor that must actively dismantle the structures of white supremacy, heteronormativity, and economic exploitation. In traditional democratic theory, individual rights are often held up as the highest ideal. However, a liberationist perspective calls for a shift from individualism, and I would say that rugged hyper-individualism, to community. The shift is evident in the work of liberation theologies and movements like the Zapatistas, who viewed democracy as a communal and collective project. Enrique Dussel argues that a democracy rooted in liberation must prioritize the needs and voices of those at the margins. He criticizes modernity's focus on individual autonomy, suggesting instead a democracy that values relationality, interdependence, and mutual care. Democracy, from a liberationist perspective, is not simply about the right to vote or speak, but about creating conditions in which all people can thrive. Anzaldua's concept of Nepatla, a Nahuatl word meaning the space between worlds, offers a metaphor for this collective, community-focused democracy. She describes Nepatla as a space of tension where transformation happens. In a democratic sense, Nepatla invites us to imagine a political community that holds space for different identities, cultures, and ways of being. Can we imagine that to manifest? This requires moving beyond binary thinking, us versus them, citizen versus non-citizen, and embracing a more fluid, inclusive vision of democracy. A democracy that genuinely embodies belonging and freedom is not static. It is resilient, adapting to the changing needs and identities of its people. This resilience is not born of stability, but of constant questioning, challenging, and responding, and expanding. Eddie Glaude Jr., drawing on Baldwin, reminds us that true democracy requires us to confront the parts of ourselves and our societies that resist change. For Glaude, democracy is an aspirational practice, one that demands honesty, humility, and courage. The Zapatistas modeled this resilience in their ongoing struggle for self-determination. They do not seek to replace one system of power with another. Instead, they envision a democracy that is fluid, responsive, and rooted in community accountability. Their example reminds us that resilience in democracy comes from centering those who have historically been left out and building a system that can withstand challenges without resorting to oppression. A resilient democracy recognizes the need for justice in all its forms: economic, racial, gender, and environmental. It requires an acknowledgement of historical wrongs, as Glaude and Dussel emphasize, and a commitment to restorative practices. It understands, as Anzaldúa writes, that nothing happens in the real world unless it first happens in the images of our minds. Democracy, then, begins with our ability to imagine a different world, to truly imagine a different world, one where belonging and freedom are extended to all. As we consider what it means to create a democracy of belonging and freedom, we are invited to see democracy as a liberationist project. This democracy is not a finished project or product, but a continuous process shaped by the ongoing work of those who have been denied belonging and freedom. It is a democracy that demands we address the conditions of unbelonging and unfreedom that still persist, whether through systemic racism, economic injustice, or the marginalization of queer and indigenous voices. To build this democracy, we must, as Anzaldúa writes, dance in the face of our fears. Let me read that again. To build this democracy, this imaginative project, we must, as Gloria Anzaldúa writes, dance in the face of our fears. We must confront the structures of power that seek to divide and exclude. We must give up the oppositional politics of us versus them. And we must commit ourselves to a vision of democracy that is inclusive, compassionate, and resilient. This is a democracy that belongs to everyone. And it is up to us to bring it to life. Thank you. Now, this is my first time doing this, and I'm not sure what happens next.
Well,
okay, Q&A. I like to do Q&R because I don't have any answers, but I have lots of responses to questions. So feel free to ask away. You're going to see some slides continue until it finishes. We're on 72 of 87.
as usual, please go into the microphone for the sake of people on Zoom. What questions do we have?
Hi. I guess there's one. So you were talking about the importance of kind of fighting against, like this pressure of an us versus them and to resist change. And you kind of repeated the idea of, the importance of resisting it. Can you talk more specifically about why it's important and the impacts of resisting that, I guess, resistance to change and exclusivity?
Well, I can say that a lot of resistance comes from oppositional politics. This us versus them mentality, this binary thinking. And my suggestion is to nurture a non-oppositional politics, which I get from Gloria Anzaldúa, Ana Luis Keating, and other Chicana feminists, other Latinas. And it's this sense of, if we can nurture the right kind of relationship, then oppositional politics will fade away. And for democracy to work, we have to be in right relationship with people. And so this sense of resistance to change, I think, is a resistance to be in real relationship.
I have a question too.
Sure.
I sense sometimes, and maybe this is just because I'm getting old at this point, but I sense sometimes that whenever things are going rough, we have a tendency to feel like, oh, these are the worst of times that there ever have been. And when times are good, we seem to go to the other extreme that, oh, these are the best of times that ever have been. Where regarding any of the struggles in society that you talked about, do you feel like we are today compared to, or is there not really a gradation of?
Well,
better,
I would say better for whom? Because we often say, oh, these are the worst of times, but worst for whom? We still have an assault on the poor. Hundreds of poor people die every day for not having enough resources. So I think if we still have a problem with poverty, and if we still have a problem with food insecurity, then we're all not thriving. And, when we see an election as we just did, what I see and what I translate from that is, oh, this will just embolden people who feel entitled to speak out against the underside of history. And so, is this good times for some? And is this bad times? Yeah, for a lot of people. So I don't think we can calibrate whether we are living in a good society based on that question. Because until we focus on the underside of history, until we focus on the least of these, I don't know that we'll be in right relationship with one another or the world.
I hope I can adopt that perspective. Thank you.
Thank you for that talk. It was really thought-provoking. I wondered what your thoughts were about this kind of leaning on politicians that we have to make things right rather than taking things to the grassroots, because For me, really where problems get fixed is when people talk to people as opposed to expecting other people to take care of those problems and being a mouthpiece for them. Where are some spaces do you think that we as community members could invest in to have some of those conversations?
Well, I mean, I think it's happening. I think that people are waking up to the need for community resilience and community work. I think if we're honest, and I tend to say things that you're not supposed to say in public, so I might do that right now just to give you a warning. If we're going to rely on two political parties that hoard money, I don't think that's our salvation. I do think that we need to be hyper local right now, which is why we are hosting dinners at the church, just trying to bring people together. It's why I spoke at the protest on Sunday, that now is the time to nurture visible and invisible ecologies. The hyper local is where it is right now. And if we don't get that right, we're not going to survive ourselves. I mean, if there is a time, there's always been a time for community, always. There's always been a time for relationship, always. But in this accelerated environment of violence, a culture of violence, who do we trust? Do we have networks of trust? If we don't have networks of trust, then we cannot have networks of care. And if we don't have networks of care, we cannot create conditions for networks of solidarity. So it's the time is ours now. What do we want? What kind of democracy do we want? What does that look like? We need to be very clear on what we want. And that will take some time. And that will take a lot of like happy hours. We gotta talk to people, you know, we gotta start eating with people. And until we begin to practice democracy on the hyper local, we're not gonna change things very much. It is my sense. And there are risks to that.
Hi. I was wondering what you thought about the idea that, I mean, maybe in a climate where democracy itself can seem so oppressive, do you think that now more than ever it's time to exercise our rights to vote, even if engaging in democracy might, I don't know. Does that make sense?
I mean, I think we should always be voting our conscience.
Mhm.
And our values. And the more we do that, the more we can begin to exercise a voice. But I'm not real clear that we as a community are clear on our values. And that's because we're not in a relationship with one another. And then that we're siloed in these different institutions.
Does that mean we should abstain from voting if we
I can't hear you.
Sorry. Does that mean we should abstain from voting if we as a society don't yet know our values?
I can't answer that question. I'm not sure.
Okay.
And there was a question right here.
I'll bring the mic over.
Thank you for this riveting and important talk and a really important time. Your references to historical thinkers. I mean, I'm a historian, so I'm thinking about history, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the way that you kind of invoke the thinkers of the past to remind us that we're not alone. I keep thinking that like what we need is already here. And like people have confronted these problems before, and like the Black liberation tradition and the others that you bring up here give us some of the ideas and the inspiration. And I'm wondering if you're looking at practical examples from the past and learning from those and bringing those forward. And you could talk a little bit about that, or just generally how history is inspiring you and making you feel.
I mean, I'm not very
powerful.
practical. I'll tell you that because my PhD is in high theory, and so I tend not to be very practical. But I'm trying. So one of the things that I think that we could do, like on a daily basis, is talk to each other. And all of this work has been footprinted before. by the Black Panthers. You know, they fed people. That's what we're doing here. Black liberation strands, you know, they have taken care of their own. And for some reason, those of us who have proximity to power have forgotten these practical steps that communities have taken. We have fully assimilated into the hyper rugged individualism of modernity. And so when we decide to step out of that container and into community, which we can see all of the thinkers are pushing for, but you know what I find about white America as a Latino is that I find white folks often don't know how to foster intimacy. They know how to have transactional relationships, but there is no intimacy. So the quality of connection is it's unstable. And so, you know, I know a lot of people are talking about attachment theory, but I'm really curious about an ontology of belonging. Where can we just talk about belonging? And what does it look like for us to belong here in Alfred? And what can history teach us? What can Alfred's history teach us about belonging? Are we even thinking about that? And sure, it's complicated, but all history is complicated. And one of the practical things that I've done is just start feeding people. And just like our house is a revolving door. We have people there every night. You know, I'm like barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, you know, but not. And if we can just start having meals with one another, it's hard to, I used to do this when I lived in Nashville. I would talk with really conservative people, but it's hard to hate people when you're eating a roasted chicken and greens. And so can food foster intimacy? I think so. And if you look at all of these different projects, the Black Panthers and other Black radicals, they used food as the technology for connection in so many ways. And so why can't we resurrect that? So that's my practical, that's what I'm doing in practice, feeding people.
Other questions or comments? There is gratitude and praise also in the Zoom chat.
Oh, okay. Should I look at that? Ah. Great.
Yeah. So thank you so much for speaking today. Yeah. I'm just wondering about like the role of democracy in like this era of what seems to be like fascism and like coming authoritarianism. And I guess like thinking about like scales, like I know you're talking about like community, and I think that's going to be like the most important thing, but it just kind of seems like with I don't know. It just seems like people are not very informed, like as a nation. And like I don't know, it just like seems like everything is very divided. And I don't know.
I mean, some would say this country has always been fascist, right? There's that narrative. And and then there are people who will say this country has always been destined for autocracy, right? So I don't like the direction that this country is going, but I do think that people power is better power than hegemonic power at a federal level. And I think that we can be counter hegemonic by building community, by eating together, by, you know, we're going to have another art show in the sanctuary, right? These counter hegemonic practices where we invite beauty into the chaos, where we invite relationship into fragmentation, where we invite connection in the midst of chaos. These counter-hegemonic practices, maybe that's my practical, these counter-hegemonic practices is I think where we need to be focused, or we'll just despair. And I don't want to live a despairing life. I want to be joyful. I want to celebrate beauty. I want to be in relationship with people. But some of that comes down to on what do we stake our life? What are we willing to stake our life on? Do we really love our neighbor? Do we know our neighbor?
Thank you so much.
Chase.
So many good questions. And I'm going to look up so many words. Hegemonic is one of them. So I have a question, and it goes back to, I don't know who was asking about voting, because for me, I think that we all have to vote. And I am a person who likes to eat with people and dance with people and search for joy and beauty and all that sort of thing. But do you think that there's a place where it can be combined, where we can not, and I'm not saying you're saying this, I'm just asking a question and it's kind of blurry in my head, so it's going to be a blurry question, but where we can still be involved in our political system and be working on local community for change and eating together and dancing together and et cetera.
I mean, the brilliant part about that is you get to choose. You have agency.
Right.
You get to choose where you opt in and where you opt out.
Yep.
And so for some people, they're going to be highly politically engaged
Yep.
in a political party. And then there are other people who are going to organize outside of political parties. And I think we need both.
Right. But do you think there's also a middle ground hybrid?
There's always a third space.
Always a third space. Okay.
And we are trying to imagine that third space
Got it.
or third way, if you will.
Yep.
And, I try to tell the truth every Sunday.
Yeah.
And that is what I'm trying to go after, is what is a path forward? Because what we've been nurturing is not working.
Truth. Okay. Thank you.
Sounds fair.
So I really appreciate Chase's observations and questions, but I also have to go a little bit farther. 328 to 330 million people need services, need assistances, and yes, we can provide a lot of those things on a local level, but we can't, I don't see a path, maybe this is the third space, I don't see a path where we can provide good public health advice, good public health service, and so on, just by, I'm not minimizing what you're suggesting, but just by being with people. We do need agencies, I think, that will make that possible.
But that's a way of being with people. We don't have the infrastructure to be with people. And are we going to trust these systems, or are we going to create a system that can care for the underside of history?
Would you do me a favor, I'm sorry, and define what you mean by underside of history? Because I'm a history buff, but I'm not sure I understand what you're saying there.
The marginalized people, anybody who's marginalized,
Okay, yeah, thank you.
anybody who says the periphery.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. I think one of our great challenges is offering to all marginalized peoples all over the world this kind of communication and safety and health. And I don't know how we can do that if we aren't already buying into a system that can and should provide that.
And I think what a lot of people are saying is, can we trust the system that we've been investing in? Or do we need an imagination for another system? Or another, I mean, big money runs our politics, right? So do we rely on big money and the consolidation of power to elect are governing people, or is there a different way? You know, what is the counter hegemonic way to do politics? And the American people don't have an answer to that yet. Yeah.
Could you maybe define a little bit what you mean by counter hegemonic? Because I'm not quite understanding where you're coming from on everything you're saying so far.
So hegemony is a force, a systemic force, and counter hegemony would be something that destabilizes that force. So love your neighbor, forgive people, eat with people. Those are counter hegemonic practices in the face of hegemonies. Hegemony is just a force. We live in it. You live in it. You're in it right now.
So which force specifically are you talking about? Like mainstream politics or?
Capitalism, economic devastation, food insecurity. These are all hegemonic forces that are shaping your reality.
Right. So when you're saying that voting isn't necessarily effective, are you saying, I guess, that we can't change those agencies that you were talking about by voting or from within? I think it's important to both organize locally and take care of our own locally, but also organize nationally.
Which is what I've been saying.
That's not what I've understood from what you were saying, but maybe I'm misinterpreting things. Thank you.
Probably got time for one more given the time.
I want to kind of piggyback on something that Mallory said. Mallory's a historian, I'm a historian. And I just want to kind of make the point that, you said one thing that I really do agree with, and that is that history is complicated. So we started out, roughly 400 years ago with a tiny number of white males who, property owning white males who control the political system. And then by the 1830s, 1820s, 1830s, we kind of changed that. Property qualifications disappeared. And because property qualifications for voting disappeared, many, many more males wound up voting. We became, in other words, more democratic than we had been before, at least in political terms. And then a few years later, we fought a civil war. About 700,000 men died during that war as a result of the war, and slaves were freed. And then a few years later, we wound up giving the a process of constitutional amendment, providing women, doubling the franchise, providing women the vote. And then a few years after that, we had a civil rights revolution, which largely eliminated at least legal segregation and greatly expanded, as a result of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the number of people in at least those minority communities to participate in the political process. So what I'm saying is that if you look over the course of American history, you find that we have become progressively more politically democratic. Now, are we perfect? No. Do we have, does the autocracy that we see in the Trump administration or the future Trump administration, threaten us? Of course it does. Okay, so we may wind up, agreeing on a number of things, but I don't think we should minimize the degree to which the United States has been over the course of approximately, 400 years, colonial period, national period, progressively more democratic. And what I would recommend people do, among other things, is something that most people don't do, which is to read the Constitution of the United States.
Any other comment or question?
So in your talk, you used a lot of high theory. And I think that this is one of the largest issues that we have, culturally speaking, reaching out to people. The overwhelming majority of people do not understand high theory, because in order to get into high theory, it's called high theory for a reason. And I think that the community building and, you know, feeding people and all that is something that is both really good, but also if you are feeding people and you are trying to spread the, you know, ideas that you are trying to spread, I think that this is the way that using high theory works does not go about it. I grew up in rural Western New York, and we have been like rural poor people have been left behind for a very long time. And a lot of the reasons that the election went the way that it did is because there is no outreach really to these people. And
Yeah,
really just
rural
what
America has been forgotten about.
right. And I don't think that by going for like counter hegemonic means and like just saying things and trying to go and work outside of the system, I feel as though it's going to end up hurting people more than the goals that I'm going to change. Progress is slow. If you try and tear the system down, as much as it's arguably not a great system, you don't have anything to build it back up. If our parties that are being run right now are those that have all of the money, trying to start something without power or money or anything like that is just going to leave you crushed. I just think that while you have a lot of great ideas, I think that the way that you are presenting them is kind of contributing to the same way that a lot of people feel left out of the left in politics in general, because going about it with all of the theory means that those who don't understand it don't get to contribute in the conversation. And that's all that I've got. It was long and meandering, and I apologize for that, but